A single piece of paper can destroy empires more completely than any bomb ever could. But nobody knows this until it is too late. In September of 1944, the American military understood something that would change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. They had just captured someone who would hand them the keys to breaking the entire Axis alliance without firing another shot. General Yoshi Nakamura was not his real name. That was a prison guard's name taken from a dead man's file. But the Nakamura they were holding in the military interrogation facility outside of Brisbane knew something that made him worth more alive than dead. For 7 years, he had been the bridge between Tokyo and Berlin. Every military communication between Japan and Germany had passed through his hands. Every supply order, every strategic plan, every secret. The American intelligence officer assigned to this case was Major David Stein, 41 years old, a linguistics expert who had lived in Berlin for 5 years before the war. He spoke German fluently. He understood the German mind, the German fear, the German paranoia. On the 5th day of interrogation, Nakamura sat across from him in a concrete room with a single table between them. No torture, no beating, just silence and the sound of Stein's pen writing notes. Nakamura had survived everything they threw at him, but he was beginning to break from something else: uncertainty, not knowing what the Americans wanted. On day 6, Stein entered with nothing but a folder and a single piece of paper. The letter was written in perfect German. The letterhead was from the German Chancellery. The signature looked authentic, too authentic. The contents described a secret conference in Berlin, Hitler and his closest generals discussing their strategy for ending the war. In that conference, they had made a decision that Nakamura needed to understand. Germany was going to make peace with America. Alone. Japan would be left to fight the war by itself. Nakamura's hands began to shake as he read the words. The letter detailed specific German supply shipments to the Pacific that would be cut off immediately. Real logistics numbers that only someone at the highest levels of Berlin command could possibly know. It described Japanese territories that Germany no longer considered defensible. It outlined the exact positions of German submarine forces that were being redirected away from the Pacific theater. Everything in the letter was either true or seemed impossible to have been fabricated. Stein did not ask questions. He simply left the room with the letter still on the table. He knew what he had done. He had planted a seed of doubt in the most dangerous place possible. In a man who knew everything about the secret communications between the two dying empires. A man who would soon see his family again. A man who would want to protect his career. A man who would wonder if his superiors in Tokyo knew about German betrayal. A man who would need to warn them. 3 days later, through a network of secret communications that the Americans had penetrated, Nakamura's message reached Tokyo. The Americans were watching. They were listening. And now they knew what would happen next. The Japanese military would receive a report of German treason. They would begin to believe that Germany was abandoning them. Berlin would receive confusing messages from Tokyo asking about supply commitments they had never abandoned. German generals would become suspicious that Japan was wavering in its commitment. Suspicion would breed counteraccusation. And in the space between Berlin and Tokyo, in the void of miscommunication and distrust, the strongest alliance in the war would begin to collapse. Nakamura did not understand at first what he had unleashed. He thought he was saving his country. But he was actually watching the war end, not on a battlefield, but in the minds of men who no longer trusted each other. 3 hours later in Tokyo, Colonel Takeshi Hashimoto sat in complete silence. His hands still held the decoded message. The rain was still falling outside his office window, but he no longer heard it. His mind was breaking down what the Americans had given him, what they had deliberately planted in his hands through Nakamura. The message was written in coded Japanese military language. The kind of language only someone on the inside could create. Someone who knew the protocols. Someone who knew exactly what would make an intelligence officer stop thinking and start believing. Germany is preparing separate peace negotiations with the United States. The words refused to leave his mind. His career depended on one thing and one thing only: knowing the difference between intelligence and deception, knowing what was real and what was constructed. But this letter, this information, it fit perfectly, too perfectly. Every detail that an intelligence officer would need, every fact that could be verified, every number that could be checked against supply records. His phone rang, the red one, the one that only his superior ever used. His stomach dropped. General Hideki Tojo, the man who controlled everything now, the man who could make careers and destroy them with a single word. Tojo did not call without a reason. Tojo did not chat. Tojo gave orders. The voice on the phone was cold, controlled, not angry, but something worse. Focused. Hashimoto, I need you to audit our entire relationship with Berlin. Every supply commitment, every military promise, every communication, I need it verified within 48 hours. I do not want estimates. I want facts. I want to know exactly where Germany stands with us. Hashimoto understood immediately. Someone had gotten to Tojo. Some intelligence had made Tojo doubt the alliance. But what? Hashimoto was the liaison officer. He received all communications with Berlin. He should have known this first. But he knew nothing. He hung up and called his deputy, Captain Yuki Matsumoto, 29 years old, brilliant with numbers, afraid of nothing. When Matsumoto arrived, Hashimoto showed him the intelligence report that Nakamura had somehow managed to transmit from his prisoner cell in Australia. The captain's face went white, not from the information itself, but from what it implied. If this was true, if Berlin really was negotiating separate peace, if Japan really was about to be abandoned, then every strategy, every plan, every sacrifice they had made in the Pacific suddenly meant nothing. We start now, Hashimoto said. Every shipment, every promise, every communication with Berlin since 1941. I want it cross-referenced. I want to see patterns. I want you to find me evidence. But sir, Matsumoto said quietly, what if we are wrong? What if we accuse Berlin of betrayal and they are not guilty? What if this is a trap? Hashimoto looked at him for a long moment. What if we are right? What if we do nothing and we discover too late that our only ally in this war has left us to die alone? Which mistake is worse? Matsumoto nodded. The hunt began, and as the intelligence officers in Tokyo started to pull files, started to review every interaction with Germany, started to measure every shipment against every promise, they began to see what the Americans had known they would see. Not betrayal yet, but the seeds of it. Delays in deliveries that now seemed suspicious. Promises made in vague language. Communications that were technically truthful but emotionally distant. Every small administrative compromise of wartime suddenly looked like evidence of a dying alliance. In Berlin, 3 days later, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel received a report that Tokyo was conducting an unprecedented audit of German military commitments. The report came from a junior officer who had intercepted Japanese radio communications. Keitel did not understand why at first. Then he understood. Japan was doubting him. Japan suspected betrayal. Keitel sat alone in his office. The walls around him were covered with maps. Maps of Europe, where Germany was losing ground every day. Maps of the Pacific, where Germany had no influence. He knew what had happened. Someone had told Japan that Germany was making peace, that Germany was abandoning the war. It did not matter if it was true. It mattered that now Japan believed it. He called a meeting with Adolf Hitler's command staff. "We need to audit our own commitments," he said. "They are questioning us. We need to verify that we have delivered everything we promised." "What did we promise?" asked General Alfred Jodl. "Nobody remembers anymore. The promises we made in 1941 were made by men who thought we would conquer the world. Keitel nodded. Then find me those men. Find me those files. Because when Japan finds out that we made promises we could not keep, that we sacrificed their interests to save ourselves, that we chose the Russian front over the Pacific War, then they will know exactly what we are. They will know that we have abandoned them. And so in Berlin, as in Tokyo, the files started to move. The accountants started to calculate. The evidence started to accumulate. And in both cities, the intelligence officers began to construct the story that the Americans wanted them to see. A story of betrayal. A story of broken faith. A story that was entirely built on a forged letter and a captured Japanese officer, and the simple fact that two great military powers at the end of a dying war needed someone to blame for their failure. Neither city knew that an American naval intelligence officer in Brisbane was reading every transmission, watching every investigation unfold in real time, listening as the greatest military alliance of the century began to die, not from military defeat, but from the simple virus of mutual suspicion. General Hideki Tojo sat in absolute silence at his desk in Tokyo. The intelligence report lay before him. 4 words from a field officer in Australia. Germany is abandoning us. His fingers did not move, his face did not change. But inside his mind was collapsing. The entire strategy, the entire war, the entire partnership that had sustained Japan for 3 years was dissolving with 4 printed words on a page. He picked up the red telephone. His hand was steady, but everything else was trembling. Within 30 minutes, he was sitting across from Admiral Manechi Koga, the younger man, the one who had inherited a war that was already impossible and only now was understanding the true extent of his inheritance. Tojo said nothing at first. He just placed the intelligence report on the table. Let Koga read it himself. Let Koga understand by reading what Germany was doing. Leaving, running, abandoning. Koga's face did not show emotion, but his jaw tightened. He was 57 years old and had spent 35 years building a career around the assumption that Japan was never alone. Japan was never abandoned. Japan was part of something larger, an empire, an alliance, a community of nations fighting for survival. Now, in a single moment, that assumption had cracked. "What do we do?" Koga asked. His voice was hollow, the voice of a man watching the future he had planned evaporate in real time. Tojo said one sentence: "We prepare to fight alone," and that sentence changed everything. Across the world in Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood in the same kind of silence. The intelligence report on his desk was identical in meaning, but different in language. Intelligence from Tokyo indicated that the Japanese were conducting a complete audit of German military commitments. They were verifying. They were checking. They were preparing for betrayal. Keitel understood immediately what this meant. They don't believe us anymore. They think we are already planning to abandon them. He called a meeting with Adolf Hitler's command staff. The men came in expecting routine reports about supply lines and strategic positions. Instead, they found Keitel staring at a map of the Pacific with the intensity of a man watching an empire die in slow motion. He said 3 words: "The Japanese have doubts." That was all it took. 3 words, and suddenly everyone in the room understood that the partnership that had sustained German strategy in the East was now poisoned, that Japan would no longer accept German reassurances, that Japan was preparing for a war alone. By nightfall in Berlin, the German military had made a decision: if Japan no longer trusted them, if Japan was preparing for separation, then Germany could not waste resources on a war that was already lost in spirit, if not yet, in fact. The Pacific theater was no longer a German responsibility. Germany had to focus on survival. Germany had to prepare for the final battles in Europe. The supply shipments were stopped immediately, not out of malice but out of military logic. Why send supplies to an ally that no longer believes they are your ally? Why maintain commitments to partners who are already preparing to fight without you? In Tokyo, when the news came that German supply shipments had halted, Tojo understood that the last piece had fallen into place. Germany had confirmed what the intelligence suggested. Germany was abandoning them. The war was now a one-front war. Japan against the world alone. Tojo called a meeting of the War Ministry. These were the same men who 3 months earlier had believed in the Axis, who had believed that partnership meant something, that honor meant something, that commitments made in 1941 still mattered in 1944. Now they sat in silence as their commander told them the truth they could not bear to hear. We are alone. Every strategy we build from this moment forward must assume that we are alone. Every soldier we deploy from this moment forward must understand that he is deployed in a war where his only ally is his own courage. The words fell like stones. There was no anger, no recriminations, just the cold realization that the alliance was dead. In Brisbane, Major David Stein sat in an intelligence center reading the intercepted radio traffic between Tokyo and Berlin. He watched the moment when Tokyo finally acknowledged the supply cutoffs. He watched the moment when Berlin issued orders to redirect Pacific resources to the Russian front. He watched the moment when both militaries began the painful process of accepting that they were alone. Stein picked up his pen and wrote a single sentence in his classified report. The war is over. The Axis is dead. It will take another year for the battles to end. But the outcome has already been decided by a forged letter and a captured man and 2 great powers that no longer trust each other. He stood up from his desk and walked outside. The Pacific sun was setting over the ocean. Thousands of miles away, Tojo was looking at the same sun setting over the same ocean. And thousands of miles in the other direction, Keitel was watching the sunset over a frozen Russian landscape. None of them knew that their fates had been decided by a single piece of paper. None of them understood that the only difference between victory and defeat was how much a man was willing to believe in betrayal. Stein went back to his office and filed his report. It would be classified for 30 years. It would be forgotten by the historians who studied the Pacific War because the war itself would be so overwhelming and so consuming that nobody would notice the moment when it was actually decided. Not on a battlefield, not in a command center, but in the space between 2 great military powers, in the space where trust had once existed, in the space where a lie had grown into truth. Admiral Minechi Koga stood on the bridge of his flagship in December of 1944. The Pacific stretched before him like a tomb. 16 capital ships, 52 destroyers. Everything else was burning or sinking or gone. He held the intelligence report with hands that did not tremble, but trembled anyway, inside where nobody could see it. Germany was not sending the promised cruisers. The supply routes through Southeast Asia were dead. The alliance was dead. Koga did not speak for 5 minutes. He just stared at the ocean. Around him, officers waited for orders. But there were no good orders anymore. There was only the slow math of a war without help, a war without hope, a war without an ally. He turned to his chief of staff. We are alone now. The words were 4 heavy stones dropped into water. Around the bridge, the reaction was not explosion, but implosion. Men understanding that the framework of everything they had built was gone. That the partnership that had defined Japanese strategy for 3 years had evaporated because Berlin had stopped believing in them. In Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel sat in his office reading reports from the Russian front. The Soviets were advancing 30 kilometers per day. The German army was collapsing. And somewhere in the Pacific, Japan was waiting for reinforcements that would never come. Keitel understood what had happened. He understood that Tokyo was conducting audits of German commitments. He understood that Tokyo no longer trusted Berlin. He called his chief strategist into his office. What did we promise Japan? When did we promise it? Are we delivering? The strategist laid out files. 140 supply shipments promised, 80 delivered, 30 diverted to the Russian front, 20 abandoned at sea. Every number was a failure, every diversion was a betrayal. Keitel made a decision that took 2 minutes. Stop all shipments to the Pacific. Do not question it. Do not debate it. If Japan no longer believes in us, then we do not waste what little we have on partners who have become doubters. The order went out. It was filed. Within hours, the first supply ships were turned around. Tons of weapons, tons of ammunition, all redirected to a front where Germany was dying anyway. In Tokyo, when the confirmation came that German supply shipments had ceased completely, Admiral Koga felt something break inside his mind. Not anger, not frustration, just the cold recognition that the die had been cast. Japan would spend the next year fighting without support, calculating supply lines with no backup plan, planning campaigns knowing that no reinforcements would ever arrive. Koga called a war council. 20 officers sat around a table. He distributed maps, charts, mathematics. We will prepare for a war alone. Every soldier must understand that his only ally is his own will to survive. Every plan must assume that we are fighting without German support. He watched their faces absorb the reality that had already been decided thousands of miles away in a room they would never see, by men they would never meet, based on evidence that did not exist. Meanwhile, in Brisbane, Major David Stein sat in his office reading the intercepted communications between Tokyo and Berlin. He watched the moment when Germany ordered the supply cutoff. He watched the moment when Tokyo accepted the reality of isolation. He watched 2 great militaries make decisions that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives, based entirely on a letter he had forged. Stein opened his classified report. 43 pages. 43 pages documenting how an intelligence officer with a typewriter and a captured man had rewritten the future of the Pacific War. He wrote the final paragraph with his hand steady and his mind disintegrating. I have achieved a military victory without firing a single shot. I have destroyed an alliance by making both partners believe they had been betrayed. I have changed the course of human history through psychology rather than military power. And now I must confront the only moral truth that matters. The soldiers who will die in this war because of my operation will die believing they were abandoned by allies. They will die believing their sacrifice was worthless. They will die not knowing that their deaths were decided not by strategy, but by a lie. And I will have to live with that knowledge for the rest of my life, that I have killed hundreds of thousands of people by making them lose faith in each other, that I have weaponized the human capacity for doubt, that I have won a war by proving that men are more fragile than any bomb. Stein closed the file. He would seal it and classify it. 30 years later, it would be discovered by historians who would barely understand its significance. By then, Koga would be dead. Keitel would have been hanged at Nuremberg. Nakamura would have died in a Tokyo prison. And Stein would be an old man living in a small house in Vermont, trying not to think about the mathematics of his victory, about how many people had died so that 2 great powers could learn not to trust each other. He stood up and walked outside. The Pacific sun was setting. Beautiful, indifferent, the same sun that was setting over Tokyo, where Koga was reading reports about Japanese losses. The same sun that was setting over Berlin, where Keitel was watching maps show German defeat in real time. The same sun that had shone on all the soldiers who were about to die because an American intelligence officer had understood one essential truth about human nature: that people are willing to destroy themselves if they can be made to believe their partners have abandoned them first. Stein walked to the end of the pier and looked at the water. Beneath the surface there was nothing but darkness, just like the darkness inside his own mind now, just like the darkness that would soon fill the Pacific when the battles began in earnest, when soldiers discovered that they were truly alone, when they discovered that their greatest enemy was not the American military, but the simple erosion of hope. The slow death of faith in the men fighting beside them. The understanding that somewhere far away, men just like them had given up.